This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello there. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. To start off, Kesh from Montreal says, Dr. Sapolsky, you talk a lot throughout your work about the neurobiology of in-out group distinctions, such as the corresponding differences in amygdala responses. As a mixed race person myself, I was curious if there's any research into our kin recognition systems. Are we naturally more flexible in this aspect, or do we still tend to default to one group? Does the environmental impact of who we grew up around outweigh any of these other biological factors?
Interesting string of questions based on material we've covered way back. Just to review that earlier material, one of the depressing findings in neuroscience: take somebody, stick them in a brain scanner, and flash up faces in front of them. And you're looking at what activity is in different parts of the brain in response to each picture. And the depressing finding, well replicated by now, is you flash up the face of someone of a different race than your own. And in about 75% of subjects, there's activation of the amygdala. Amygdala, fear, anxiety, aggression. Okay, maybe that isn't so interesting. We know our societal stereotypes, even if we don't ascribe to them. We've been conditioned. We think about what the face is. No, this is not that. This is the amygdala activates in under 1/10 of a second. That's before there's even conscious awareness of what you are looking at. This is an extremely automatic response. Of course, the question becomes, what's up with the 25% of people where this doesn't happen? And this is going to wind up being a bit relevant. These are people who've had extensive exposure to people of other races early in life, people who have had a close, intimate relationship at some point with somebody of another race. But the basic finding, 75% of people, within a fraction of a second, the amygdala activates. I'm made nervous. I'm made fearful. I'm made anxious. I'm made just on the edge of deciding some aggression is called for. Really depressing. Less famous is a second, equally interesting response in that literature. There's another part of the brain called the fusiform cortex. And what it does as a primate specialty is it recognizes faces. It categorizes faces. Oh, we primates are so into faces. Turns out it's broader than that. It categorizes things that are of great personal relevance to you. So if you're a bird watcher, for example, and you have your fusiform cortex that could distinguish between a bald eagle and a Kirtland's warbler, you've got a whole list of the categories that matter to you. Classic sports cars, composers, whatever. But what it does in most humans is it categorizes, it responds to faces. And the depressing finding here that goes hand in hand with the amygdala one is flash up the face of someone who is of your race. The amygdala is silent. The fusiform activates. Ah, it's a face. And now flash up the face of a them. And not only do we see the amygdala responding very rapidly, the fusiform doesn't respond as much. A face of a them doesn't register as much in your brain. Now, what this has prompted is a whole line of research that involves a whole lot less detail than finding yourself a brain scanner, but something built on that fusiform finding, which is people remember faces better if those are faces of their own race, if those are faces of whatever they categorize as in group. So you're flashing up a whole bunch of faces. Have you seen this face before? And people are more accurate if it's the face of their own race. And this is a very widespread phenomenon going hand in hand with a preference for looking at the faces of an in-group racial member. These are widespread classic studies showing white and African American white test subjects remember white faces more accurately than African American faces. It's been shown the same exact thing bidirectionally with white and Asian Americans. It's been shown in Malaysia of Malaysians and Chinese faces. The Chinese are a somewhat outgroup minority there. Likewise in Malaysia, Malaysians remembering Indian faces, another minority outgroup there. One really interesting finding back to white subjects who were in the scanner, and white face fusiform activates bring up the face of someone, a white face, where you have all the contextual cues that this is someone who is poor, who is homeless, and the fusiform doesn't activate as much. And the amygdala activates a little bit, not as much as for an other race face, but you could see a poor white person. For your average lucky white person, a poor white person's face almost counts as a them. So, of course, one wants to know, where does this come from? This own race bias in terms of preference, and as a cognitive measure, in terms of being able to accurately remember somebody's face, it is there really early on in life. 3-month-old kids already show a preference for same race faces, and they already have a more accurate memory for in race, in group faces than out group. Okay, 3-month-olds are pretty bad at answering questionnaires. How did they find this out? Totally elegant, cool stuff. You got this kid there looking at the screen with pictures flashing up, and you've got a camera that can track eye movement. And when you flash up the face of an in group member for a 3-month-old infant, they look at the picture longer than if it's an out group member. So that's telling you something about preference. What about accuracy of remembering what face you've seen before? Totally cool. So you flash up somebody's face and the kid looks at it, and then you flash up the same face again. And again and again, and each time the kid looks at it less. It's getting boring. The kid is habituating to that face. And now you flash up a different face of the same race. And if the kid goes, "Whoa, who's that? That's brand new," and looks longer, they know that's a different face. They remember that's a different face. On the other hand, if the habituation curve just keeps going down, down, they don't know that that's a different face. They don't remember. So those are the sort of techniques that could be used to show that by 3 months, kids are preferring the faces of in-group members, and they have more accurate memories for in-group members. Now, of course, this brings up all sorts of disturbing things. Does this show, as a lot of people have jumped on incorrectly, that we have a genetic predisposition towards racism if it's there at 3 months? Hell no. By the time you're 3 months old, you've had 3 months of postnatal environment and 9 months of intrauterine. No evidence for genetic. Okay, are the parents teaching the 3-month-old racism? And this brings to mind, are parents sitting around and they're alternating between reading Goodnight Moon and Mein Kampf to the kid? Not that either. It's a completely passive process, which is there's some sort of rule in the heads of kids already at 3 months and heading for the first year of life, that faces that you have seen before, types of faces that are familiar, you categorize as an us. And whoever you're exposed to in that first year of life, in other words, whoever represents in-group members with your parents, with your family, you categorize as an us, and you prefer those faces. You prefer their accents, you prefer hearing the language that they speak, and you remember it more accurately. So this is not inborn racism, nor is this active teaching of racism. This is just a filtering process. Familiar faces, familiar voices become preferred and easier to remember. And for most people, that's a starting point for beginning to see faces of other races as thems. So, at what age can you now get a lot of exposure to faces of thems and have them become us's, so you don't have this own race facial memory bias? The studies show up until around 12 years of age. That's the window for the plasticity. Now, where people have gotten the clearest evidence for this is one of God's gifts to behavioral biologists, adoption studies. Adoption studies where a kid, for example, is adopted from China and is raised by white parents in the United States, who counts as an us for that kid? And what you see is pretty much the same rule. Whoever counts as a familiar face in the environment this kid is growing up in, up until 12 years of age or so, gets categorized as an us. So you have a kid from China who's adopted at 2 months of age and now grows up in a community that is overwhelmingly non Asian, instead is white. And they're going to do the preference for white faces in a fraction of a second with their eyes and better memory for white faces. Now, how can that be changed when you have one of the things that I think is a predictor of a more successful inter-ethnic, interracial adoption, which is if the parents have been putting in a great deal of effort for that child to know where they came from and what their culture is. Parental efforts to do that broadens the range of who's going to count as an us in terms of that kid growing up. What sort of faces do they prefer looking at? What sort of faces register with them for a long time accurately? So that suggests there's this developmental window in the first 12 years of life. What this brings us to now is the original question: how about people who are biracial? What's their categorization? Who counts as an us? And the US, of course, has had an interesting history of dealing with biracial individuals. There was, of course, the notorious 19th century rulings in courts, the one drop of blood rule, which shows an interesting bias. If you have one drop of blood, let's not translate that into modern genetics, but if you have at least a little bit of inheritance from what is viewed as a minority outgroup race, you were classified as that group forever after, in censuses, things of that sort. What the view during that period also was that a biracial individual early on in life picks one of the races, identifies with it entirely, and when they're put into circumstances where they are dealing with members of the race of their other parent, they are interacting with them, they are showing implicit responses as if it is an other race. That picture has mostly been debunked. Modern thinking instead focuses on a developmental stage process. And what you typically see in biracial kids is early on, they strongly identify with one of the races. And you can show that in terms of questionnaires. You can show that in terms of eye tracking, all the usual techniques. And that usually involves a period where there is active, overt rejection of their other racial identity. There may be hostility. And what then happens developmentally is a stage where you begin to appreciate the other half of who you are. And what that eventually results in is integrating the two halves into one. And this gives rise to a very trendy, very interesting, very legitimate notion here of intersectionality. You don't get someone who says, well, I am half Czech and half Maasai. You get someone who reaches the stage of saying, I'm Czech Maasai. Their singular identity is at the intersection of these two, intersectionality. So that's the standard picture. Nonetheless, what you see very interestingly, even if you have a person who's got a stable singular identity at the intersection between the two, it could be manipulated. It could be forced one way or the other. A great measure of this is the strength of their identification with the biracial aspects of this. And this is wonderful work that was done by Hazel Marcus, psychologist at Stanford, where you take biracial individuals and they're filling out a questionnaire: who you are, how old, where you're from, et cetera, what your race is. And if they have to check one race, they can't check two boxes, or they can't check biracial. If you force them out of their comfortable, stable, I am at this intersection, they have stress responses. Versus if you give them the option to say, I'm both of these, or I, in fact, am biracial. So forcing someone out of their confident, comfortable place in the middle, an intersectionality case of inventing a new who am I, You get stress. What you nonetheless get is all sorts of societal circumstances where biracial individuals have to show a great deal of context dependent flexibility as to which legacy, which parental background of theirs is dominating in their mind at the time. And what studies have shown is it is most driven by the appearance of people around you, driven by the cultural knowledge that is being paraded in front of you. Is this one of your areas tapping into, forcing you, tilting in one direction to be making more sense of what's going on? And third, in terms of importance, who the peer group is around you at the time. And being able to navigate this sort of switching is challenging, and it is often very stressful for individuals, but it is anchored much more stably, much more successfully if this is not someone who's I'm half this and I'm half that, and instead I am check Messiah. Now, of course, all of this is how the biracial person is thinking about themselves. How does the rest of the world view a biracial individual? And you know exactly what the next sentence is going to be, which is it is super context dependent. And great example of this. This was a study published in 2007, which I was part of, one of my most adventurous reaching out in unlikely directions. This was with some sociologists and psychologists. And what we did in the paper was show a color band, a band where subjects would be presented with this band that was basically white at this end, black at this end, and gradations in between. And the subject would then be asked, where on this continuum, where on this line would you place the skin color of the then new presidential candidate, Barack Obama? And what we saw very interestingly was Republicans saw him as blacker than Democrats did. So all sorts of contextual stuff. So what this brings us to is the core of the question. So you get a biracial individual. How are they at recognizing faces of the two different races, remembering them accurately? And what you see in general is exactly what was brought up in the question. There's more flexibility. A white African American biracial individual is better than your average white person at remembering black faces and better than the average black person at remembering white faces. It's a broader range. There's more flexibility. There's more resilience. There's context dependency, of course. Sit down a biracial individual and say, tell you what, write me a paragraph about a time where you felt particularly close to one of your parents. And they do that. And afterward, they show more of the typical race face memory skewing of that parent they were just writing about. You can tilt that in that direction. So you can have somebody with a stable, more open, resilient by sense of category of who counts as a me, who counts as an us, but you could tilt it in one direction or another. You could do the same thing with, rather than biracial, bicultural. And these are studies with Latino Americans showing that the face memory thing shows the same deal of wideness. Latino Americans are better at remembering white faces than Latinos are, and the other way around, all of that, a wider range. But what you show is prime them, tilt them in one of those directions, ask somebody to write a paragraph. How do you feel about your Latino heritage? How do you feel as an American? And you tilt them in one way or the other. Now, what's implicit in all these studies is a simple fact about all of us, which is we belong to multiple groups at the same time. We have multiple identities. I am this race or biracial, this religion, this ethnicity. I'm left-handed, I'm right-handed. I prefer Star Wars to Star Trek, whatever your identifications are. We all carry multiples of them. And what you see is context dependency will bring different identities to the forefront under different circumstances. Now, one of the best studied versions of that and most pernicious is you take people who are heavily identifying with as a major piece of who they are, being a member of an out group. And if you prime them, if you give them cues, about some of the negative stereotypes of that group they belong to, you are going to have adverse effects on their functioning. And this is a famous literature that was started in the late 1990s by the psychologist Claude Steele, a Stanford colleague, looking at stereotype threat. You look at people from outgroups, and if you remind them of their outgroup status, their test performance goes down, their impulse control goes down, all sorts of ways of which this has been shown. Have somebody fill out a questionnaire where, as part of the questions, you were tapping into their outgroup identity. Another case of it, you're an outgroup member taking a stressful exam and sit down in your seat. And if on either side of you are members of the dominant culture, you get a stereotype threat effect. Your score tends to go down on the average. The person up in the front handing out the tests, if they are a member of the dominant group, that will also trigger a stereotype threat response. Great example of this in terms of sex. Have a female chess player, and if she sits down facing off against a male chess player, everybody on earth, from the Czechs to the Maasai, know that men are better at chess than women. I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no, but everybody knows that. And if her opponent is male, her average performance in a chess tournament will go down versus if her opponent is female. So, what is this about? And what the studies have shown is physiological level, be in a setting where stereotype threat is being activated in you like crazy, and your blood pressure goes up. You secrete elevated levels of cortisol, stress hormone, glucocorticoids. On the cognitive level, you show the person is being distracted, is being aversively pickled by their status as an outgroup member. Working memory goes down, concentration goes down, attention goes down, confidence goes down, your prediction as to how you did on the test goes down. And what's probably most important about that literature, most discouraging, is even if the outgroup member rejects that stereotype about their group, that simply isn't true. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. It works in them as well. Not as much as someone who's totally bought in to the derogatory, denigrating views of their own outgroup status, but even in someone who says, that's crap, that's not actually how it is. Now, that literature, as I said, has been around since the late 90s. About a decade after that, in came the replication crisis in psychology, showing some pretty sloppy standards. The modern versions of studies of looking at stereotype threat have been more rigorous, and what they show is the effect is absolutely there, but it's not as extreme as the first generation of studies. What this brings us to now is we have multiple identities. If you manipulate someone into focusing more on one of those identities than another one, do you change how they behave? Do you change how they view themselves? And this brings us, in terms of manipulating the different inputs into intersectionality, a classic study carried out 1999 by Margaret Shee, Todd Patinsky, and Nalini Amdadi at the Harvard Psychology Department. Famous studies, been cited more than 2,000 times. They took test subjects, Asian women, mostly undergrads, I believe, Asian women taking a math test. And they tapped into one of two different identities that an Asian woman would be having. As someone Asian, what is the cultural stereotype? On the average, Asians are better at math than other groups are, which tends to be the case. Or another stereotype, on the average, women aren't as good at math as men are. And bring each one to the forefront. And they did this brilliantly. Before they did the math test, they filled out a questionnaire. In one case, the questionnaire was So, do you live in a dorm? Is it a co-ed dorm? Is it a single-sex dorm? If it's a single-sex one, do you prefer it? What would it be three reasons why you prefer it? Can you think of some reasons why you would prefer a co-ed dorm? Think about your sex. Think about your gender. I know I'm using them interchangeably, which will give somebody conniptions. Okay, think about your societal gender. That's what you're focusing on. And the Asian American women taking this math test, the womenness came to the forefront. And on the average, that suppressed math scores. On the other hand, give them a questionnaire beforehand, which is priming them to think about their Asian identity. So, how many generations ago did your family come to the United States? Do you speak the ancestral language? How many generations of people in your family are still alive who speak that? Is that what is spoken at home? Bring that to the forefront, and suddenly math scores get better. Fantastic. Great control group. Have the person fill out a questionnaire about their feelings about the university phone service. That's the control group. Okay, so showing there, tap into positive stereotypes about your subgroup, your particular identity, and that can boost performance. Tap into the negative stereotypes, exactly the opposite. Totally cool. Interesting elaborations on that study because, again, it has been cited more than 2,000 times. In other words, it is cited in a ton of follow up studies. One example, Canada. Canada does not have as strong of the stereotype that Asian Canadians are better at math than other Canadians. You don't see that priming effect there. Really interestingly, you can use tapping into the positive stereotype to make someone perform worse. What's that about? If you prime them to be so conscious of the stereotype, oh, everybody knows that Czech people are better at Parcheesi than Maasai people, and we've just prompted you, you Czech Maasai, to be thinking so much about your Czechness that you up the expectation so much. And in a subset of individuals, that becomes stressful for them and performance goes down. Who are those individuals? Those are the ones who would say, for example, yes, 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 I know on the average Czech are better at math. And yeah, I know. But personally, I'm not one of those. I'm not particularly good at math. Tap into that stereotype, that positive stereotype enough, and you're going to be activating anxiety and pressure and performance expectations, and they will actually get worse. Okay, so what have we seen here? Early in life, you were making a rule, and us is whatever faces seem most familiar. So that early in life, you were already having a preference for us faces, and you're remembering them more accurately, and the neurobiology of what's going on underneath makes perfect sense. Biracial individuals, if they are following the current model, things tend to work out best when instead of forming a half this, half that, they form a stable intersectional identity. Nonetheless, amid that, society demands a fair amount of flexibility to flip one way or the other, depending on the circumstance, not only biracial, bicultural as well. Stereotype threat is there and remind out-group members of the negative stereotypes about them, and that will disrupt their functioning. But in the end, this particular study with the math, depending on which relatively neutral identity you are tapping into in somebody who has multiple identities, you can shift their performance significantly.
Now, Eric from Seattle asks, what are eye floaters?
Eye floaters. Who could resist? For 100+ episodes, we've been waiting for an eye floater question. Eye floaters. We all know what they are. You look at a blank wall, you look at a clear blue sky, and you see those little things floating around. You see little bits of cellular debris floating around on the surface of your eye. Myths. Everything I just said is a myth. There are all these myths about floaters that need to be debunked. First off, they are not cellular debris. We'll see what they actually are. Next, they're not on the surface of your eye. They are called entoptic, which is to say something inside your eye. Your eye is filled with this squishy, vitreous gel stuff, which I find a little bit unsettling. And the floaters are inside there. Next, you are not really seeing them. You are seeing their shadow from inside the eye, light bouncing back. You are seeing the shadow that they cast. And finally, myth to dispel is they're not really floating. Okay, so what is up with these floaters of such destructive mythology? They are not cell debris. What they are instead is inside your eyeball, you got that vitreous gel stuff, which is gelatinous, and nonetheless, it's got some structure. It's got sort of a protein superstructure scaffolding thing running through it that gives it some stability. And this protein scaffolding is made of this stuff called collagen. And it's microscopic and you don't see it, but within your eye, there's this whole three-dimensional scaffolding matrix network thing there of collagen. So, where do floaters come from? Time. Over time, you get a period where you get a little bit low in gel in one part of your eye, and thus two of the superstructural columns come close to each other. Or as we age, your eye tends to have less of that gel stuff. So more of these columns of superstructure are coming close to each, and they adhere. You begin to get aggregates of the collagen inside your eye. And enough of those aggregates, and it begins to cast a shadow. That's what a floater is. You were not looking at cellular debris, you were looking at thickening of some of these collagen branches inside. So that's totally normal as you begin to get some floaters and you look at a blank wall and you see more of it. If you wake up one morning and there's a massive explosion of floaters, that may mean you've had a retinal tear. But in most cases, what you're seeing is the collagen superstructure thickening. You're not actually seeing that. You're seeing the shadow that it casts. So, not cellular debris, and it's not on the surface of your eye, and you're not really seeing it. You're seeing its shadow. Finally, the floating element, it is not just floating around loosely, it's within this gelatinous matrix. And I think if you put a chunk of collagen inside a bowl of jello and let it adhere in there and you shake it around, it'll move, but it is not freely floating. It's moving around. That's a measure not of the thickened collagen floating around. It's a measure of the gel vibrating one way or the other. Now, there's some circumstances that explain why, as we get older, you've got more floaters, so much to look forward to. If you're one of the youngins out there, you get more of those floaters, you get more aggregates of collagen inside your eye as you get older. Two basic pathways. One is one of the most reliable things on earth. If you look at cellular aging and stuff that changes over time, you get the production of oxygen radicals. And as a result, you get oxidative damage, oxidative changes to molecules in various places in your body, very relevant to brain aging. In the eye, you get oxidative changes to the collagen so that they get stickier. You get more aggregates. The other is you've got these things called advanced glycation end products. These were discovered in the 80s. Advanced glycation end products, AGEs, age, you bet they celebrated when they came up with that one, has to do with the fact that glucose, sweet, innocent glucose can, with enough time, just randomly stick to proteins and kind of stick them together. And at that point, you've got that happening with collagen. You get advanced glycation end products. And you look at diseases where people have chronically elevated levels of blood glucose, diabetes, for example, and your prediction is, oh, that should make a whole lot more of these AGE linkages forming these aggregates of collagen. You should have a lot more floaters. That seems to be the case. That's the least of the issues there. It's also acting elsewhere in the eye to increase your risk of cataracts. Now, predictably, since people have been noticing floaters since we first had opposable thumbs, people have been opining about it. And Aristotle noticed them and attempted to describe them. And of course, this has fostered all sorts of paranormal, spiritual stuff there. These are little animals you're seeing on the surface of your eyes. These are spiritual. So that's generated a predictable thing. Just the scientific end of them without all this spirituality hoo ha, they're pretty interesting in kind of a weird way. This is something you can see that by definition, no one else can see. This is you being able to see inside your body. You're never actually seeing it. You're only seeing the shadow that these things make. And you can never look directly at it because if you shift the focus of your eyes over to try to look at it there, that shifts the gel and it moves out of the way. So, what weird, mysterious stuff is that? And this gave rise to an obsession, probably explaining why I've been randomly riffing on the Czech Republic, a Czech biologist, physician in the 19th century named Jan Perkinji. If you learn biology, he is one of the towering figures of hard-assed science, hard-assed anatomy. There are more things and more different parts of the body named after Perkinji. In the cerebellum, there are Purkinje cells. In your heart, there are Purkinje fibers. There are Purkinje branching patterns in neurons. There's something called the Purkinje shift, which is towards the end of the day as light is going down. There's a shift between the dominance of your rods and cones in your eyes where you begin to see colors less vividly. That's called the Purkinje shift. There's all sorts of other Purkinjes in there. Purkinje was just handing out names of totally verifiable, real things in the body, not the stuff where you're seeing the shadow. He got obsessed with floaters, and apparently he spent huge amounts of time staring at bright lights long enough to cause interesting after images and to try to draw pictures of them, making what are called pressure phosphenes, which is you press the side of your eye and close the other one. And after a while, you begin to see all sorts of iridescent stuff and try to understand that and trying to understand floaters as well. And apparently he was gently mocked in his circles for how much of his time he was spending on this not quite spiritualist stuff, but this is not a part of the body that you can identify. This is some weirdo process that only you can see. He produced some really interesting diagrams of floaters, as we see here. So floaters have been a source of fascination for a long time.
There we have it. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.